Jonathan Cole sat alone in his study, staring out the tall windows as snow blanketed the manicured grounds of his Pinebridge estate. The faint glow of Christmas lights from the town square in the distance was visible even through the haze of his thoughts. Pinebridge, a town that transformed into a postcard-perfect winter wonderland every December, buzzed with cheer and activity. But for Jonathan, the holiday season had become a ritual of loneliness. It had been 10 years since the loss of Emily, his only daughter. She had been the light of his life, her laughter echoing through the halls of the mansion that now seemed impossibly empty. His marriage to Clara, once filled with hope and warmth, had devolved into a polite yet icy coexistence. They occupied the same house but lived in separate worlds, their shared grief building walls instead of bridges. The clock struck 9, its chimes reverberating through the quiet room. Jonathan sighed, closing the file of financial reports on his desk. He had buried himself in work for years, finding solace in the predictability of numbers. Tonight, though, he felt an unfamiliar restlessness. The holiday decorations that Clara had arranged with precision felt more like a facade than a celebration. As he rose to leave the study, something caught his eye. A figure huddled at the bottom of the grand staircase outside the mansion. He squinted, unsure if it was a trick of the snow or his imagination. Grabbing his coat, he stepped outside, the icy wind biting against his face. There, nestled against the cold marble steps, was a little girl. Her small frame trembled under a thin, tattered coat, her cheeks flushed from the freezing air. Her tear-streaked face tilted up as he approached, and her wide, frightened eyes met his. "What are you doing here?" Jonathan asked, his voice gruffer than intended. The girl sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. I got lost," she said softly. "I was looking for my mom." Jonathan crouched down, his tone softening. "You shouldn't be out here alone in this weather. What's your name?" "Maggie," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Well, Maggie, let's get you inside where it's warm. We'll figure out how to find your mom," Jonathan said, extending his hand. She hesitated before taking it, her small fingers icy against his. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them, and Jonathan guided Maggie to the living room, where a fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace. Clara appeared in the doorway, her perfectly coiffed hair and elegant attire betraying her surprise at the scene. "Who is this?" she asked, her tone more curious than concerned. "This is Maggie. She was outside alone," Jonathan explained. "She says she's lost." Clara's eyes softened as she knelt to Maggie's level. "Oh, sweetheart, you must be freezing. Let me get you some blankets." Maggie nodded, her expression wary but grateful. As Clara left the room, Jonathan sat in one of the oversized chairs, watching Maggie cautiously examine her surroundings. Despite her obvious exhaustion, there was a spark of curiosity in her gaze. "You live in a big house," Maggie said after a moment, her voice small but steady. Jonathan chuckled dryly. "It is big. Too big sometimes. Doesn't it get lonely?" she asked, the innocence of her question catching him off guard. "Yes," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of his response. "It does." Clara returned with a blanket and a steaming mug of hot cocoa, which Maggie accepted with a small smile. The girl sipped carefully, her tiny hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. "Do you remember where you last saw your mom?" Clara asked gently. Maggie shook her head. "We were at the Christmas market. It was crowded, and then I couldn't find her." "We'll call the local authorities," Jonathan said, already reaching for his phone. Maggie's eyes widened. "Please don't. She'll be so worried if she thinks the police are looking for me." Jonathan paused, considering her plea. "Then we'll try another way. Do you know her phone number?" Maggie recited it, and Clara quickly dialed. While they waited for someone to answer, Maggie looked around again, her gaze lingering on a family portrait above the mantel. It was of Jonathan, Clara, and Emily, taken years ago. "She's pretty," Maggie said, pointing at Emily's smiling face. Jonathan's throat tightened. "She was," he replied quietly. Before Maggie could ask more, Clara spoke up. "I couldn't reach anyone, but we'll try again soon. For now, you can stay here tonight, Maggie." "Thank you," Maggie said, her voice full of relief. As the fire crackled and snow continued to fall outside, Jonathan found himself watching the little girl, feeling a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years, a fragile but undeniable connection. He didn't yet realize how much this lost child would change his life. Jonathan woke the next morning to the sound of muffled laughter echoing faintly through the mansion. It was an unusual sound in his home, one that made him pause as he pulled on his robe. Following the noise, he walked down the sweeping staircase and toward the kitchen, where the warmth of baking cinnamon filled the air. Clara was at the counter, rolling dough, her sleeves pushed up in a way Jonathan hadn't seen in years. Maggie sat on a high stool, her legs swinging as she sprinkled sugar onto a tray of cookies. The little girl's cheeks were pink, no longer from the cold, but from a glow of joy. Jonathan leaned against the doorframe, unnoticed for a moment, watching Clara smile at Maggie's enthusiastic gestures. He couldn't remember the last time Clara had looked so at ease, so natural. It was as though Maggie had cracked through a wall neither of them had dared approach. "Good morning," he said finally, and both Clara and Maggie turned to him with matching grins. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," Maggie chirped, her voice full of a cheerful energy that seemed to carry the sunlight streaming through the large windows. "Jonathan," he corrected, his tone softer than usual. He stepped into the kitchen, feeling oddly out of place in the domestic scene. "It smells good in here." Maggie wanted to bake cookies, Clara explained, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I thought it would be a nice distraction while we wait to hear from her mother." Maggie's face fell slightly at the mention of her mother, but she quickly brightened. "We're making Christmas trees and stars. Do you like cookies, Jonathan?" "I do," he said, taking a seat at the island. "Especially when they're made by experts." Maggie giggled, and Clara handed her another sheet of dough to cut. Jonathan watched them work together, something stirring in him he couldn't quite name. For so long, the house had been a place of muted routines, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of Clara's phone or the distant footsteps of the staff. Now, with Maggie there, it felt alive. After breakfast, Jonathan stepped into his study to make some calls. He wanted to ensure Maggie's mother was located as quickly as possible. Despite the warmth she brought to the house, he couldn't shake the unease of having a lost child under his roof. Something about her story didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The first call was to the local authorities, who confirmed they were actively searching for Sarah. They promised to keep him updated. Next, he called a friend who worked with a local charity, hoping to widen the net. As he hung up, he noticed a faint knock at the door. "Come in," he said, expecting Clara. Instead, Maggie peeked her head around the door. "Hi," she said softly, stepping inside. "Can I talk to you?" Jonathan gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Of course." Maggie climbed into the oversized seat, her legs dangling. For a moment, she fidgeted, staring at her hands. Then she looked up, her expression surprisingly serious. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said. "I don't think I said that last night." "You're welcome," he replied. "We're happy to have you here." Maggie tilted her head. "You don't seem very happy." The comment caught him off guard, and he chuckled despite himself. "Why do you say that?" "You have a sad look in your eyes," she said simply, her tone carrying the unfiltered honesty only a child could muster. "Like you're missing someone." Jonathan's chest tightened. "I suppose I am," he admitted after a pause. "My daughter, Emily. She passed away a long time ago." Maggie's eyes widened. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "It's been a long time, but sometimes it still feels like yesterday." Maggie nodded, as if understanding something far beyond her years. "My mom says people we love never really leave us. They stay in our hearts." Jonathan swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Before he could find the words, Maggie slid off the chair and walked around the desk. She wrapped her small arms around him, her hug warm and unexpected. "I think your daughter would want you to smile more," she said. Jonathan blinked, the lump in his throat making speech impossible. He patted her shoulder gently, marveling at the simple, profound wisdom of her words. The day passed quietly after that, with Maggie bouncing between helping Clara and exploring the mansion under Jonathan's watchful eye. She was fascinated by everything, from the grand piano in the parlor to the intricate ornaments on the Christmas tree. As evening approached, Jonathan found himself drawn into her orbit, her enthusiasm pulling him out of his usual brooding solitude. After dinner, the three of them sat by the fire, sipping hot chocolate. Maggie's chatter filled the room as she shared stories about her mother, how they loved decorating a tiny tree in their apartment, singing carols together, and baking cookies in a cramped but cozy kitchen. "You and your mom seem very close," Clara said, her voice tinged with a wistfulness that Jonathan recognized immediately. "She's my best friend," Maggie said with a proud smile. Then her face clouded for the first time since morning. "I hope she's okay." Jonathan leaned forward. "We're doing everything we can to find her, Maggie. I promise." She nodded but didn't look reassured. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Jonathan glanced at Clara, who met his gaze with a rare softness. It was as if Maggie's presence had reminded them both of something they had lost. Not just Emily, but each other. As the clock chimed 9, Jonathan helped Maggie settle into the guest room. She climbed into the enormous bed, dwarfed by the fluffy pillows and blankets. As he turned to leave, she called out, "Good night, Jonathan." "Good night, Maggie," he replied, pausing at the door. "Sweet dreams." As he closed the door behind him, he stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle over him. He couldn't deny it any longer. This little girl, lost and vulnerable, had awakened something in him he thought was long buried. For the first time in years, he found himself hoping. The next morning, Jonathan awoke earlier than usual. The faint light of dawn crept through the curtains, and he felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Slipping into his robe, he headed downstairs, his footsteps echoing faintly in the still quiet mansion. As he reached the kitchen, he was surprised to find Maggie already there, seated at the island with a steaming mug of cocoa. She looked up and smiled at him, her eyes lighting up with a brightness that warmed the room. "You're up early," Jonathan said, pulling out a chair to join her. Maggie nodded. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my mom." Jonathan's chest tightened at the raw worry in her voice. "We'll find her, Maggie. I promise." She nodded again, though her small shoulders sagged slightly. "I know. It's just, she's all I have." The words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. Jonathan reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "You have us now, too, for as long as you need." Maggie looked at him, her expression softening. "Thank you, Jonathan." Clara entered the room moments later, her hair swept back and her expression more rested than it had been in weeks. "Good morning," she said, pausing when she saw the two of them together. "Am I interrupting something?" "Not at all," Jonathan replied, standing to pour himself coffee. "We were just talking." Clara smiled faintly, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief. Maggie hopped down from her seat and went to help Clara set the table, chattering animatedly about her plans to build a snowman later. Jonathan watched them, feeling a strange mix of contentment and unease. This connection, so natural and easy, reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years. After breakfast, Jonathan called the police again for updates on Sarah. They assured him that their search was ongoing but hadn't turned up any leads yet. Frustrated, he hung up and decided to take matters into his own hands. He grabbed his coat and told Clara he was heading into town. Pinebridge was bustling with holiday cheer. Streets lined with twinkling lights were filled with shoppers clutching bright red and green bags, their breath visible in the frosty air. Jonathan's imposing figure cut through the festive crowd as he made his way to the Christmas market, where Maggie had said she last saw her mother. The market was alive with the hum of activity. Vendors calling out their wares, children laughing, and carolers singing in harmony near the town square. Jonathan approached a stand selling handcrafted ornaments. The vendor, a kind-faced older man, looked up and greeted him with a nod. "Looking for something special?" "Not quite," Jonathan said. "I'm looking for someone. A woman who might have been here 2 nights ago with a little girl." The man's brow furrowed in thought. "A lot of people come through here. Can you tell me more?" Jonathan described Sarah as best as he could from Maggie's brief mentions. A woman in her 30s, with dark hair and kind eyes. The vendor shook his head apologetically. Sorry, I can't say I remember, but maybe try the soup stand down by the gazebo. The woman there sees just about everyone. Thanking him, Jonathan made his way to the gazebo, where the aroma of rich stew and baked bread filled the air. The woman running the stand looked up as he approached, her sharp eyes taking him in. "You're not here for soup, are you?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "No," Jonathan admitted. "I'm looking for someone. She was here with her daughter 2 nights ago." The woman tilted her head thoughtfully. "I might remember something. A little girl with dark hair and a big smile, right?" Jonathan's pulse quickened. "That's her. Do you remember the woman she was with?" "Not much," the woman said, frowning. "I remember the little girl because she seemed so excited about the lights. But the mother, she seemed anxious. Nervous, maybe. I didn't get a good look at her, though." Jonathan pressed further, but there wasn't much more the woman could offer. Thanking her, he turned away, his mind racing. Nervous. The word stuck with him as he walked back to his car. Why would Sarah have been anxious? What had happened that night? By the time Jonathan returned home, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the snowy landscape. He found Maggie and Clara outside, building a snowman in the front yard. Maggie's laughter rang out as Clara helped her place a crooked carrot for the snowman's nose. Jonathan parked the car and stood for a moment, watching them. There was something so simple and pure about the scene that it almost felt surreal. He realized he didn't want it to end. Not the laughter, not the warmth Maggie had brought into their lives. As he approached, Maggie ran to him, her boots crunching in the snow. "Look, Jonathan." We made him smile. Jonathan glanced at the snowman's lopsided grin and couldn't help but smile himself. "He looks perfect." Clara joined them, brushing snow from her gloves. "How was town? Any news?" Jonathan shook his head. "Not much. Just bits and pieces." Clara's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "We'll keep trying." They went inside, where the fire was already roaring in the hearth. Maggie insisted on reading aloud from a book of Christmas stories, her voice animated and full of wonder. As she read, Jonathan caught Clara's eye. For a moment, they shared a look, a quiet understanding that neither needed to put into words. Later that evening, as Jonathan sat in his study, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Sarah's story than they realized. He thought of Maggie's words, her unwavering faith in her mother. If Sarah had been anxious that night, perhaps it wasn't just the crowd. Perhaps something, or someone, had frightened her. Jonathan resolved to dig deeper. For Maggie's sake, and for the hope she had sparked in all of them, he would not stop until he found the answers they needed. That night, as the household settled into quiet, Jonathan couldn't sleep. His mind kept circling back to Sarah. There was something he couldn't reconcile, something that nagged at him from the edges of his thoughts. He went downstairs to his study, the glow from the fire casting long shadows across the room. Pulling out his laptop, he decided to take a more methodical approach. If Sarah had been in trouble, perhaps there was a record of it somewhere. He began searching local news archives and police reports, hoping to find some clue. After an hour of fruitless searching, he leaned back in frustration. Just as he was about to close his laptop, a small article caught his eye. It was from several weeks ago, buried among other local stories. "Single mother assaulted in parking lot," the headline read. Jonathan's heart sank as he scanned the brief report. A woman fitting Sarah's description had been attacked outside a grocery store late at night. She had escaped with minor injuries, but the assailant had not been caught. The police suspected it was a random mugging. Jonathan frowned, his instincts telling him it wasn't random at all. He printed the article and set it aside. If this was connected to Sarah's disappearance, he needed to know more. The next morning, he called Clara into the study before Maggie woke up. She entered, her expression curious but concerned. "What's going on?" Jonathan handed her the article. "I found this last night. It's about a woman who was attacked a few weeks ago. I think it might be Sarah." Clara's eyes widened as she read the article. "Do you think this has something to do with why she's missing?" "I don't know," Jonathan admitted, "but it's a lead. I'm going to follow up with the police today." Clara nodded, her face set with determination. I'll keep Maggie occupied. She doesn't need to worry about this. Jonathan left shortly after, driving to the police station. The officer at the desk greeted him politely but seemed skeptical when Jonathan explained his theory. It could be the same woman, the officer said, flipping through some files. But we didn't have much to go on. The victim didn't want to press charges, and she didn't leave contact information. Did she say anything about why she was attacked? Jonathan asked. The officer shook his head. She claimed it was just a random mugging. But, he hesitated. She seemed scared. Not just shaken up, but genuinely terrified. We thought there might be more to the story, but without her cooperation, there wasn't much we could do. Jonathan left the station with a sinking feeling. If Sarah had been running from something, or someone, then finding her might be more complicated than he'd thought. When he returned home, Maggie was playing in the living room, her laughter filling the space. Clara met him in the hallway, her expression tense. Anything? Not much, Jonathan said, lowering his voice. But I think Sarah might have been running from something. Clara's brow furrowed. What do we do? I'll keep digging, Jonathan said. For now, let's just keep things as normal as possible for Maggie. Over the next few days, Jonathan threw himself into the search. He reached out to private investigators, scoured more records, and even returned to the Christmas market to speak with other vendors. But the answers remained elusive. All the while, Maggie seemed blissfully unaware of the growing tension around her. She spent her days exploring the mansion, playing in the snow, and filling the house with her cheerful energy. One evening, as Jonathan sat by the fire with Maggie and Clara, Maggie brought up something that stopped him in his tracks. My mom said she had a secret, Maggie said casually, arranging a row of toy animals on the rug. Clara glanced at Jonathan, her eyes narrowing slightly. A secret? Maggie nodded. She said it was something really important, but she couldn't tell anyone. Not even me. What kind of secret? Jonathan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Maggie shrugged. I don't know. She just said it was for our safety. Jonathan's mind raced. If Sarah had been hiding something, it might explain everything. The attack, her disappearance, even her nervousness at the market. He didn't want to alarm Maggie, so he let the conversation drift back to lighter topics. But later, when Maggie was asleep, he brought it up to Clara. Do you think Sarah could be in some kind of danger? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's possible, Jonathan said, but I don't know what it could be. If she was trying to protect Maggie, that would explain a lot. We have to find her, Clara said, her tone resolute. Whatever it takes. Jonathan nodded. He had already decided the same. The breakthrough came 2 days later. One of the private investigators Jonathan had hired called with new information. They had tracked down a former neighbor of Sarah's who mentioned seeing strange men hanging around her apartment a few months ago. Sarah had told the neighbor they were just repairmen, but the woman didn't believe her. She looked scared, the neighbor had said. Jonathan relayed this information to the police, urging them to treat Sarah's case as more than just a missing person. He also decided to confront Maggie gently, hoping she might remember something else that could help. Maggie, he said one evening as they sat in the study, a puzzle spread out between them. Do you remember those men your mom told you about? The ones who might have been bothering her? Maggie hesitated, her small hands pausing over the puzzle pieces. She said not to talk about them. It's okay, Jonathan said softly. You're safe here. I just want to help your mom. Maggie looked up at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. Finally, she nodded. They came to our house once. My mom told me to hide in the closet. She said they weren't nice. Jonathan's heart sank. This was worse than he'd imagined. Whatever Sarah was involved in, it wasn't just a misunderstanding. He knew then that finding her was more urgent than ever. As Maggie leaned against him, her trust evident in the way she relaxed into his side, Jonathan felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just searching for Sarah now. He was protecting Maggie too, and he wouldn't stop until they were both safe. Jonathan barely slept that night. Maggie's revelation had opened a door to a darker reality, one he hadn't fully prepared for. Whoever those men were, they weren't just a vague threat. They were real, and they had terrified Sarah enough to send her into hiding. Sitting in his study as the first light of dawn filtered through the heavy drapes, Jonathan mapped out his next steps. The private investigator would continue digging into Sarah's connections, but Jonathan felt he needed to take a more active role. He wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth. By the time Clara came downstairs, Jonathan had already called several contacts, including a friend who worked with a legal advocacy group. Clara entered the study quietly, carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee. She placed it on his desk and sat across from him, her concern evident. "You've been up all night," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Not after what Maggie told us." Clara wrapped her hands around her cup, her gaze steady. "What's your plan?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "The investigator is following a lead about Sarah's former employer. Apparently, she left her last job abruptly, and there's no record of where she went after that. It could be nothing, but it's a thread worth pulling." Clara nodded. "Do you think it's connected to those men?" "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm starting to think Sarah was running from something bigger than just a bad situation." Clara's expression darkened. "And Maggie was caught in the middle." Jonathan felt a pang of guilt. Maggie's cheerful demeanor had masked just how much she'd been through. He resolved to do whatever it took to keep her safe, even if it meant confronting some hard truths. Later that morning, as Maggie played in the living room, Jonathan received a call from the investigator. The lead about Sarah's former employer had turned up something significant. Sarah had been working as a personal assistant for a high-profile businessman in the city. She had resigned suddenly, citing personal reasons, but the timing coincided with when the strange men had first been spotted near her apartment. Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. If Sarah's former employer knew something, it might be the key to finding her. He wasted no time arranging a meeting, leaving Clara to keep an eye on Maggie. The drive into the city was a blur of anxious thoughts. When Jonathan arrived at the sleek, modern office building, he was met by a receptionist who escorted him to a private conference room. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s with sharp features and an air of authority entered the room. "You must be Jonathan Cole," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm Richard Benson. I understand you're looking for information about Sarah." Jonathan shook his hand, studying the man carefully. "That's right. She worked for you, didn't she?" "She did," Benson said, taking a seat. "And she was an excellent employee. I was sorry to see her go." "Did she ever mention why she left?" Jonathan asked, trying to gauge Benson's reaction. Benson hesitated, his expression growing serious. "She didn't say much, but I could tell something was wrong. She seemed distracted, nervous. When I asked if she needed help, she assured me everything was fine, but I didn't believe her." "Did she have any conflicts while she worked here? Anyone who might have had a reason to threaten her?" Benson shook his head. "Not that I'm aware of. But," he leaned forward, lowering his voice, "there was an incident about a month before she quit. A man showed up at the office, asking about her. He claimed to be a friend, but something about him didn't sit right with my staff. We told him she wasn't available, and he left." Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. "Did he come back?" "No, but Sarah seemed shaken when we told her about it," Benson said. "She asked if we could remove her contact information from the company directory, which we did." Jonathan pressed for more details, but Benson didn't have much else to offer. Still, it was another piece of the puzzle. Thanking Benson for his time, Jonathan left the office with a growing sense of urgency. If someone had gone to the trouble of tracking Sarah to her workplace, they weren't going to stop easily. By the time he returned home, dusk was settling over Pinebridge. Maggie greeted him at the door, her face lighting up as she ran to hug him. "You're back." Jonathan knelt to her level, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'm back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I missed you." Clara appeared in the hallway, her eyes searching his for answers. He gave her a small nod, silently conveying that he had more to share later. For now, he focused on Maggie, who eagerly pulled him toward the living room to show off a gingerbread house she and Clara had built. That evening, after Maggie had gone to bed, Jonathan filled Clara in on what he had learned. Her expression grew grim as he recounted the details of Benson's story. "So someone was following her," Clara said. "That explains why she was so scared." Jonathan nodded. But we still don't know who or why. And until we do, we can't bring Sarah back safely. Clara reached for his hand, her grip firm. We'll find her. Together. Jonathan looked at her, surprised by the resolve in her voice. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his burdens lift slightly. Clara wasn't just supporting him. She was standing beside him, ready to face whatever came next. As they sat in the quiet of the study, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of determination. They were getting closer to the truth, and he wouldn't stop until Sarah was safe and Maggie's life was no longer overshadowed by fear. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he was ready to face them. For Maggie, for Sarah, and for the hope of a brighter future. The next morning brought a sense of cautious optimism to Jonathan. While the pieces of Sarah's story were still scattered, he felt they were beginning to form a picture. Over breakfast, Maggie chattered happily about the gingerbread house she and Clara had worked on the day before. Jonathan listened, nodding and smiling, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying his conversation with Richard Benson. He was certain the man who had visited Sarah's workplace was connected to her disappearance. After breakfast, Jonathan excused himself to make another call. This time, he reached out to his lawyer, hoping to use legal channels to dig deeper into Sarah's past. If she had taken steps to hide herself, there might be public records, leases, changes of address, or financial transactions that could offer clues. The lawyer promised to look into it, but Jonathan knew it would take time. Frustrated but determined, he returned to the living room, where Maggie was building a tower out of wooden blocks. Clara sat nearby, flipping through a magazine but glancing frequently at the little girl with a soft, almost protective look. "Maggie," Jonathan said, sitting on the floor beside her, "do you remember anything else about the men who came to your house? Maybe something they said or did?" Maggie frowned thoughtfully, her hands pausing mid-stack. "They didn't say much, but one of them had a scar, right here." She pointed to her cheek, tracing an invisible line from her eye to her jaw. It was scary. Jonathan exchanged a look with Clara, who had set down her magazine. "That's helpful, Maggie," Clara said gently. "You're very brave to remember all this." Maggie smiled faintly, but her focus shifted back to her blocks, as if retreating from the weight of the conversation. Jonathan didn't push further, not wanting to overwhelm her. Still, her description of the scar was a critical detail. He jotted it down in his notebook later, vowing to pass it along to the investigator. By midday, the lawyer called back with a lead. Sarah had rented a storage unit in a neighboring town just 2 weeks before she disappeared. Jonathan's heart raced as he listened to the details. A storage unit suggested she had been preparing for something, possibly to leave quickly. The lawyer provided the address, and Jonathan decided to check it out himself. Clara insisted on coming along, leaving Maggie in the care of their trusted housekeeper. The drive to the neighboring town was quiet, the tension between Jonathan and Clara unspoken but palpable. They both understood the risks involved in delving deeper into Sarah's situation. If the people who had been after her realized someone else was searching, it could escalate matters. The storage facility was a plain, utilitarian building surrounded by a chain-link fence. Jonathan showed the manager a copy of the lease agreement the lawyer had obtained, and after verifying his credentials, the man led them to a small, unassuming unit near the back of the lot. The metallic clang of the rolling door echoed as it opened, revealing a space filled with boxes, a few bags, and an old suitcase. Clara stepped inside first, her eyes scanning the contents. "This doesn't look like much," she said, but her voice held a note of unease. Jonathan began methodically opening boxes. Most contained ordinary belongings, clothes, photo albums, kitchen items. But in the bottom of one box, beneath a pile of folded blankets, he found a file folder stuffed with papers. He opened it carefully, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. The folder contained bank statements, legal documents, and what appeared to be letters. One in particular caught his attention, a handwritten note addressed to Sarah, with no return address. The message was brief but chilling. "You can't run forever. We'll find you." Jonathan handed the letter to Clara, who read it with wide eyes. "This isn't just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice shaking slightly. She was being hunted. They found more unsettling clues: receipts for burner phones, a map with several locations circled in red, and a list of names that meant nothing to them. Jonathan carefully packed everything back into the folder, determined to analyze it later with the help of the investigator. As they locked the unit and returned to the car, a cold dread settled over both of them. Whoever Sarah was hiding from, they were persistent and dangerous. On the drive home, Clara broke the silence. Do you think she knew this would happen? That's why she left Maggie at the market. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel tightly. It's possible. She might have been trying to keep Maggie safe. But why not go to the police? Clara asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Jonathan sighed. Maybe she didn't trust them, or maybe she thought the police couldn't protect her. Either way, she was clearly desperate. When they arrived home, Maggie greeted them with her usual enthusiasm, oblivious to the weight of the discovery they had made. Clara hugged her tightly, holding on a little longer than usual. Jonathan couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Maggie deserved to be a carefree child, not a piece of a dangerous puzzle. That evening, after Maggie had gone to bed, Jonathan spread the contents of the folder across the dining table. Clara sat beside him, helping him sort through the papers. They found more threatening notes, most unsigned but clearly written by the same person. The bank statement showed irregular withdrawals, as if Sarah had been pulling money in small amounts to avoid detection. One document stood out, a photocopy of a birth certificate. It was Maggie's, but the father's name was listed as unknown. Jonathan studied it, his mind racing. If the men chasing Sarah were connected to Maggie's birth, it could explain their persistence. Clara touched his arm, breaking his train of thought. Jonathan, look at this. She pointed to one of the circled locations on the map. It's only an hour from here. Jonathan stared at it, his gut telling him it wasn't a coincidence. We need to check it out, he said. Tomorrow. Clara hesitated. Do you think it's safe? I'll go alone, Jonathan said firmly. You stay here with Maggie. If something happens, I want you both to be safe. Clara didn't argue, though her worried expression spoke volumes. They spent the rest of the night organizing the evidence, preparing to share it with the investigator. Jonathan felt a growing sense of urgency. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous the situation seemed. As he climbed into bed later, exhaustion weighing heavily on him, he thought of Maggie. Her innocence, her resilience, they were reminders of what he was fighting for. No matter what lay ahead, he wouldn't stop until he found Sarah and ensured both mother and daughter were safe. He just hoped it wasn't already too late. The following morning, Jonathan was up before the sun. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood settling under the weight of winter. He moved through the hallways quietly, careful not to wake Maggie or Clara. Today's task felt heavy with consequence, and he wanted to face it with clarity. He slipped out the door, the cold biting at his face as he made his way to the car. The map with the circled location lay on the passenger seat, alongside the folder of evidence he and Clara had pieced together the night before. As he pulled out of the driveway, the snow-covered streets of Pinebridge stretched before him, peaceful and unassuming. The juxtaposition of the town's serenity with the storm brewing in Sarah's life unsettled him. The drive to the marked location took just under an hour. Jonathan's mind churned with questions. Why this place? Was it a safe house, or something more sinister? The map offered no context, only the enigmatic red circle drawn with urgency. As he neared his destination, the surroundings grew more rural. Sparse clusters of trees lined the road, and the occasional farmhouse appeared in the distance. Finally, he arrived at a small, dilapidated building tucked behind a row of overgrown bushes. It looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. Jonathan parked a short distance away, his instincts urging caution. He approached on foot, his shoes crunching softly on the snow-covered ground. The building's front door was ajar, hanging awkwardly on rusted hinges. Jonathan paused, listening for any signs of movement. The air was still, but the eerie silence did little to calm his nerves. Stepping inside, he was met with the faint scent of mildew and the creak of warped floorboards beneath his weight. The interior was as desolate as the exterior. Empty rooms littered with debris, walls marred by graffiti. But as Jonathan moved deeper into the building, he noticed signs of recent activity. A half-burned candle on a windowsill, discarded food wrappers, a frayed blanket crumpled in a corner. Someone had been here, and not long ago. In a small back room, Jonathan found something that stopped him cold. A notebook lay open on the floor, its pages filled with scribbled notes and sketches. Many of the notes were illegible, written in a hurried scrawl, but one page caught his eye. It was a list of names, several of which matched the ones they'd found in Sarah's folder. Next to one name, Maggie, a word was scrawled in large, jagged letters. Leverage. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He grabbed the notebook, flipping through it for more clues. The entries were fragmented, but they painted a picture of desperation and danger. Whoever had written this had been tracking Sarah and Maggie, their intentions veiled but undeniably threatening. As he stepped back into the main room, his thoughts racing, a noise from outside froze him in place. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Jonathan pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. He glanced around, searching for an exit. The front door was too exposed, and the back room offered no way out. His only option was a narrow staircase leading to what he assumed was the attic. He moved quickly but quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. The stairs groaned under his weight, and he winced with every sound. The attic was dark and cramped, filled with dust and cobwebs. Jonathan crouched low, peering through a small gap in the wooden slats of the floor. Below, two men entered the building. One of them had a scar running down his cheek, just as Maggie had described. Jonathan's jaw tightened. This was no coincidence. The men spoke in hushed tones, their words difficult to make out. Jonathan caught fragments, mentions of Sarah, questions about whether she'd been here recently. They seemed frustrated, their voices tinged with impatience. Jonathan stayed perfectly still, willing his breathing to remain quiet. The men moved through the building, their footsteps echoing ominously. When they reached the back room, one of them let out a low curse. "She's been here," he said, his voice rough. "Not long ago." The other man grunted. "But where is she now? And where's the kid?" Jonathan's grip on the notebook tightened. These men were hunting Sarah and Maggie, their intentions clear and dangerous. He had to get out of there and back to the mansion. Maggie's safety depended on it. He waited until the men moved deeper into the building before slipping down the stairs and out the door. The cold air hit him like a slap, but he didn't stop to catch his breath. He sprinted to his car, heart racing as he started the engine and sped away. In his rearview mirror, the dilapidated building shrank into the distance. The drive back to Pinebridge felt interminable. Jonathan's thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear and urgency. He had enough evidence now to involve the authorities more aggressively, but his priority was ensuring Maggie was safe. When he finally pulled into the driveway, the sight of the mansion brought a wave of relief. He rushed inside, calling for Clara. She appeared in the hallway, her expression alarmed. "What happened? Where's Maggie?" Jonathan asked, his voice urgent. "She's upstairs, playing," Clara said. "What's going on?" Jonathan handed her the notebook, quickly explaining what he had found and what had happened at the building. Clara's face paled as she flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. "We need to call the police," she said. Jonathan nodded. "I'll do it now. I also need to update the investigator. These men aren't just a threat. They're actively searching." Clara's eyes filled with worry. "Do you think they'll come here?" "I don't know," Jonathan admitted. "But we can't take any chances." They spent the next hour coordinating with law enforcement, providing all the evidence they had gathered. The police assured them they would increase patrols around the mansion and work on tracking the men Jonathan had described. Still, the tension in the house was palpable. That evening, as Maggie sat by the fire reading a book, Jonathan and Clara remained vigilant. Every sound outside drew their attention, every shadow made them uneasy. But they refused to let their fear show in front of Maggie, who seemed blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding her. Before bed, Maggie hugged Jonathan tightly. "Good night, Jonathan," she said, her voice full of trust and affection. "Good night, Maggie," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "Sweet dreams." As she disappeared upstairs, Jonathan turned to Clara. "We have to find Sarah before they do." Clara nodded, her resolve as strong as his. "We will." Whatever it takes. Jonathan felt a surge of determination. They were no longer just uncovering a mystery, they were in a race against time. And failure was not an option. The night passed slowly, the silence of the mansion broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant rustle of the wind outside. Jonathan sat in his study, the notebook from the abandoned building spread open on the desk before him. Its pages were chaotic, scribbled notes, crude sketches of what might have been floor plans or locations, and a handful of names that felt like puzzle pieces without a clear picture to complete. One name stood out: Robert Hensley. It was circled multiple times across different pages, with arrows pointing to phrases like "final warning" and "missing documents." Jonathan stared at it, feeling a flicker of recognition. The name seemed familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. He typed it into his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his tired face. The search brought up several results, but one in particular caught his attention: a Robert Hensley who had been indicted for financial crimes several years earlier. He had operated a fraudulent investment firm, stealing millions from his clients before vanishing just ahead of his trial. The case had made headlines briefly before fading from public attention, overshadowed by more sensational stories. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Could this be the same man? And if so, what connection did he have to Sarah? He sifted through the notebook again, piecing together the fragments of information. A few of the notes mentioned a leverage file and a safe location. Jonathan's gut told him this was more than just a random detail. It might be the key to understanding why Sarah was being hunted. Morning came, pale light filtering through the heavy curtains of the mansion. Clara entered the study, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. She set it down in front of Jonathan, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "You didn't sleep," she said, more observation than accusation. Jonathan shook his head. "I couldn't. I think I found something." He explained what he discovered about Robert Hensley, his connection to financial crimes, and the cryptic references in the notebook. Clara listened intently, her brow furrowing as he spoke. If Sarah has something that connects to this man, this leverage file, that could explain everything. They're not just after her. They're after whatever she has. "That's what I think too," Jonathan said. "But we don't know what it is or where it's hidden. And every minute we don't know feels like another step closer to them finding her first." Clara nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We have to move faster." Jonathan agreed. After a quick breakfast, he called the private investigator and relayed everything he had found. The investigator promised to look into Hensley's case and cross-reference it with Sarah's background. In the meantime, Jonathan focused on the map they'd recovered from the storage unit, trying to decipher the circled locations. One of the circles, he noticed, was marked with a faint X and the initials H. It was in a wooded area not far from Pinebridge, a place Jonathan vaguely recognized as an old hiking trail he'd visited years ago. He decided to check it out, taking Clara with him while Maggie stayed under the watchful eye of their housekeeper. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, but the tension between them was palpable. Clara held the map tightly, her eyes scanning the landmarks as they neared their destination. When they arrived, the parking area was empty, the surrounding forest eerily quiet. Jonathan grabbed a flashlight and the map before stepping out of the car. The trail was overgrown, the path barely visible beneath a layer of snow and fallen leaves. Jonathan and Clara moved carefully, their breaths forming small clouds in the cold air. The map led them deeper into the woods, away from the marked paths, until they reached a clearing surrounded by towering pines. At the center of the clearing was an old wooden shed, its roof sagging and its walls weathered by years of exposure. It looked abandoned, but Jonathan's instincts told him otherwise. He approached cautiously, motioning for Clara to stay back. The door was locked, but a quick search of the area turned up a rusted key hidden under a loose plank near the entrance. The shed's interior was dimly lit by narrow beams of sunlight filtering through cracks in the walls. It was sparse, containing only a table, a few chairs, and a locked metal box sitting in the corner. Jonathan knelt beside the box, inspecting it. It was heavy, with a combination lock securing its lid. Clara stepped inside, her footsteps tentative. "Do you think it's here?" she asked softly. "It has to be," Jonathan said, his focus on the box. But I don't know the combination. As they pondered their next move, Clara noticed something scratched into the surface of the table. M0615. She pointed it out to Jonathan, who quickly tried the numbers on the lock. With a satisfying click, the mechanism released. Inside the box was a collection of documents, along with a USB drive and what appeared to be a ledger. Jonathan flipped through the papers, his expression growing more serious with each page. The documents detailed financial transactions, false accounts, and evidence implicating Robert Hensley in an extensive web of corruption. The USB drive likely contained digital copies or additional evidence. "This is it," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is what they're after." Clara nodded, her face pale. "If they know this exists, they'll stop at nothing to get it." Jonathan packed the contents of the box carefully into his bag, ensuring nothing was left behind. As they exited the shed, the distant sound of footsteps on the trail sent a jolt of fear through both of them. They froze, listening intently. The steps grew louder, accompanied by low voices. Jonathan grabbed Clara's hand and led her off the path into the dense trees. They crouched low, hiding among the underbrush as two men entered the clearing. One of them was the scarred man from the abandoned building, his sharp gaze scanning the area. "They're here," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Jonathan nodded, motioning for her to stay quiet. They watched as the men entered the shed, their voices muffled but tense. After a few minutes, the men emerged, frustration evident in their movements. They spoke briefly before heading back down the trail, unaware of Jonathan and Clara's presence. When the men were out of earshot, Jonathan and Clara hurried back to their car, adrenaline coursing through their veins. As they drove away, Jonathan tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw set with determination. "We have to get this to the authorities," he said. "This evidence is the only thing that can stop them." Clara agreed, but her eyes flicked toward the back seat, where the bag containing the documents Saturday, "and we have to make sure Maggie stays safe. No matter what." Jonathan glanced at her, his resolve hardening. "She will. I promise." As the mansion came into view, a sense of relief washed over them. But Jonathan knew the danger wasn't over. They had the evidence, but the men after Sarah, and now, potentially them, weren't going to give up easily. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Jonathan felt they had the upper hand. They just had to stay one step ahead. The drive back to Pinebridge felt longer than usual, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily on Jonathan and Clara. The bag containing the documents and USB drive sat between them in the car, a fragile but powerful shield against the forces threatening Sarah and Maggie. Jonathan's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white, as his mind raced with plans for their next steps. When they arrived at the mansion, Clara immediately went to check on Maggie, who was sitting in the living room with the housekeeper, absorbed in a puzzle. Seeing her safe and cheerful brought a wave of relief to both of them, but the reality of the situation loomed large. Jonathan retreated to his study, locking the door behind him as he spread the contents of the bag across his desk. The documents painted a damning picture of Robert Hensley's criminal activities. There were falsified ledgers, account statements detailing embezzlement schemes, and even correspondence implicating other individuals in positions of power. The USB drive contained additional files, including what appeared to be scanned legal documents and emails. Jonathan called the private investigator, outlining everything they had uncovered. The investigator's reaction was immediate and serious. The evidence was explosive and would undoubtedly attract significant attention, both from law enforcement and from those desperate to suppress it. "I'll forward this to a trusted contact in the FBI," the investigator said. "But you need to be careful. If they're aware you have this, they'll escalate. Keep your family safe." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We will." After the call, Clara joined him in the study. He briefed her on the conversation, watching as her face grew more determined with each word. "We can't stay here indefinitely," she said. "If those men figure out where we live—" "They won't get close," Jonathan interrupted. "The police are patrolling the area, and I've already taken measures to secure the house. But you're right. We need a longer-term solution." Clara hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "Do you think Sarah knows we found this? If we could get word to her—" Jonathan shook his head. We don't even know where she is. But if she's alive, this is her lifeline. She risked everything to keep it hidden. It's up to us to protect it. The rest of the evening passed in tense silence. Jonathan monitored the security cameras he had installed around the mansion, his gaze flicking from the screens to the documents on his desk. Clara stayed close to Maggie, her vigilance a quiet reassurance that their home remained a safe haven, for now. The following morning, the private investigator called with an update. The FBI had reviewed the evidence and confirmed its validity. They had opened an official investigation into Robert Hensley's network and were working to identify and locate Sarah as a critical witness. They'll contact you soon, the investigator said, but you need to be ready. This might draw attention. Jonathan hung up, the implications clear. They had taken a step closer to exposing the truth, but it also meant they were now firmly in the crosshairs of dangerous men. He relayed the information to Clara, who nodded grimly. That afternoon, a knock at the door shattered the fragile calm that had settled over the house. Jonathan opened it cautiously, finding two plainclothes FBI agents standing on the porch. They introduced themselves and displayed their credentials, their expressions professional but urgent. Mr. Cole, we understand you've come into possession of critical evidence regarding Robert Hensley's activities, the senior agent said. We need to secure it immediately. Jonathan led them to the study, where the documents and USB drive were laid out. The agents examined the materials carefully, their faces betraying the gravity of what they were handling. This is exactly what we've been looking for, the agent said, his tone tinged with both relief and concern. Hensley has been evading capture for years, and this gives us the leverage we need. But it also means you and your family are at risk. We need to take steps to ensure your safety. Jonathan nodded. What do you recommend? We'll arrange for a secure location where you can stay temporarily, the agent replied. In the meantime, we'll increase surveillance around your property. If you notice anything unusual, call us immediately. As the agents prepared to leave, Clara appeared in the doorway, holding Maggie's hand. The little girl's face lit up when she saw Jonathan, but she hesitated when she noticed the serious expressions of the strangers. Who are they? Maggie asked, her voice small. They're here to help, Jonathan said gently, crouching to her level. Just like we're helping your mom. Maggie's eyes widened. Did you find her? Not yet, he admitted, but we're getting closer. And these people are going to make sure we stay safe. Maggie seemed to accept this, nodding solemnly before squeezing his hand. I trust you. Those simple words hit Jonathan with a force he hadn't expected. In that moment, he realized the depth of the responsibility he carried, not just for protecting Maggie and Clara, but for ensuring that Sarah's sacrifices weren't in vain. As night fell, the mansion felt both fortified and fragile. The FBI agents had promised to expedite their plans, but Jonathan knew they were in a precarious position. He double-checked the locks, the security cameras, and the alarm system before joining Clara in the living room, where Maggie was curled up on the couch with a blanket. Clara looked up as he entered, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Do you think they'll come tonight? I don't know, Jonathan said honestly. But if they do, we'll be ready. Clara nodded, her hand finding his. They sat together in silence, watching Maggie as she drifted off to sleep. Despite the tension, there was a flicker of hope in the air. A fragile but persistent reminder of what they were fighting for. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Jonathan remained alert, his mind cycling through the steps they had taken and the challenges still ahead. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt they were no longer alone. Together, with Clara, Maggie, and the support of those who believed in their cause, they would see this through, no matter the cost. The next day arrived with a dense fog hanging over Pinebridge, muffling the sounds of the town and cloaking the mansion in an eerie stillness. Jonathan woke early, his body tense with the anticipation of what lay ahead. The FBI agents had promised to return with an update, but until then, he could only wait and protect his family. Clara joined him in the kitchen as he prepared coffee, her eyes shadowed from another restless night. Maggie's still asleep, she said softly, leaning against the counter. She doesn't know anything's wrong. Jonathan nodded, grateful for the small mercy. We'll keep it that way for as long as we can. Before Clara could respond, A knock at the door startled them both. Jonathan moved quickly, glancing at the security monitor before opening it. The senior FBI agent stood there, his expression grim. "May we come in?" the agent asked, motioning to his partner. Jonathan stepped aside, ushering them into the study. Clara followed, her hand resting protectively on the back of a chair. The agents wasted no time, spreading out documents and a laptop on the desk. "We've made progress," the senior agent began. "The evidence you provided has been pivotal. We've confirmed that Robert Hensley's network extends far beyond what we initially suspected. It's not just financial crimes. There's evidence of coercion, threats, and even violence to silence witnesses." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "And Sarah?" The agent exchanged a glance with his partner before answering. "We believe Sarah has been in hiding for months, moving frequently to evade detection. The map and documents suggest she had at least 2 safe houses, one of which was recently compromised. That's likely when she left Maggie at the market, knowing she couldn't protect her while on the run." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "She sacrificed everything to keep Maggie safe." The agent nodded. "And now we need your help." Sarah left breadcrumbs in the evidence, indications of a final meeting place, somewhere she believed she could negotiate her way out of this. But it's risky. If Hensley's men reach her first. Jonathan's stomach tightened. "Where is it?" The agent pulled out a marked map, pointing to an isolated cabin deep in the mountains, accessible only by a rugged trail. "This is our best guess. We'll lead the operation, but we need you to stay here where it's safe." Jonathan's instinct screamed against the idea of staying behind. If Sarah's there, she's terrified and alone. "I need to be there." "Jonathan," Clara said softly, her voice laced with worry. "The agents are trained for this. Let them handle it." But Jonathan shook his head. "She left Maggie at that market because she trusted someone would find her. She trusted us, Clara. I can't sit here and wait." The agents hesitated. Then the senior one relented. "If you come, you follow our orders. No exceptions." Jonathan agreed, his resolve unshaken. Clara's eyes pleaded with him as he gathered his coat and prepared to leave, but she didn't stop him. Instead, she pulled him into a tight embrace. "Bring her back," she whispered. The journey to the cabin was tense and silent. The agents drove a rugged SUV, its tires crunching over gravel and snow as they ascended the winding trail. The dense forest closed in around them, the towering trees casting long shadows in the dim afternoon light. Jonathan gripped the seat tightly, his thoughts on Sarah and what she must have endured. When they reached the trailhead, the agents briefed him on the plan. The cabin was less than a mile away, but they would approach cautiously to avoid alerting anyone who might be watching. Armed and focused, the agents led the way, with Jonathan close behind. The trail was narrow and slick with ice, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft blanket of snow. As they neared the cabin, Jonathan caught sight of it through the trees. A small structure, its roof partially obscured by snow. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, a sign of recent activity. The agents signaled for Jonathan to stay back as they moved closer, their weapons drawn. He crouched behind a tree, his breath visible in the freezing air, his heart pounding. He strained to hear any sounds from the cabin, but the forest remained eerily quiet. Suddenly, a shout rang out, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Jonathan's instincts took over, and he moved toward the cabin despite the agent's orders to stay put. Inside, chaos erupted. One of the agents had subdued a man, the scarred one Jonathan recognized from before, while the other was securing the area. Jonathan scanned the room, his eyes locking on a figure huddled in the corner. "Sarah," he breathed. She looked up, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Recognition flickered across her features, and she rose shakily to her feet. "Jonathan?" He crossed the room quickly, his voice firm but gentle. "It's okay. You're safe now." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, her relief palpable. The agents finished securing the scene, confirming that the scarred man was the only immediate threat. One of them radioed for backup, while the other turned to Jonathan. "We need to move. Now." Jonathan helped Sarah gather her belongings, little more than a small bag and a coat, and led her outside. The trek back to the SUV was tense, but the weight of the danger began to lift as they descended the trail. When they reached the vehicle, Jonathan helped Sarah inside, her hands trembling as she clutched Maggie's name on her lips. The drive back to Pinebridge was quiet, Sarah too overwhelmed to speak. When they finally reached the mansion, Clara met them at the door, her face a mixture of disbelief and joy. Maggie ran forward, her eyes wide with recognition. "Mom!" she cried, throwing herself into Sarah's arms. The reunion was raw and emotional, mother and daughter holding each other tightly as if afraid to let go. Jonathan and Clara stepped back, giving them space, their own emotions threatening to overwhelm them. For the first time in weeks, the house felt truly alive, a place not just of safety, but of healing and hope. Jonathan watched as Sarah held Maggie, her whispered reassurances filling the room with warmth. Clara took his hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You did it," she said softly. Jonathan shook his head. "We all did." As the evening wore on, the agents briefed Sarah on the next steps, ensuring her safety and the protection of her daughter. But for now, in this moment, the nightmare was over. Jonathan felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that they had not only uncovered the truth, but also helped rebuild a family. And in the quiet glow of the firelight, surrounded by those he had come to care for, he realized that his own family had grown in ways he could never have imagined. Together, they had found something far greater than safety. They had found hope.